Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, May 9th. Thank you all for being with us. We will be getting started in just a moment or so. We have quite a few people registered for this event, so we're going to give them a chance to get in from the waiting room. So just sit back, relax, and be patient. We will be starting soon. Thanks. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled 12 Things to Know, Collectors Reflect, you're in the right place. We will be getting started in just a moment or two. We're going to let some folks enter from the waiting room, and then we will be getting started. So just sit back, relax, again, be a little patient, and we will be starting soon. Thanks. All right. Looks like we're a few minutes past the top of the hour. Still got some people coming in from the waiting room, but we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled 12 Things to Know, Collectors Reflect. This is a live online presentation by writer, lecturer, and collections advisor, Spencer W. Stuart. This presentation is part of our series of talks for book collectors. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 125 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and an annual keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and so much more. Now, if you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program. Tonight, we have a presentation, again, that is part of our series of talks for book collectors, and it's titled 12 Things to Know, Collectors Reflect, a live online presentation by writer, lecturer, and collections advisor, Spencer W. Stuart. Spencer W. Stuart provides advisory services to private collectors as well as institutions, aiding in the design and execution of collection development, management, and deaccession strategies. In concert with his advising, Spencer is an active writer and lecturer on histories of the printed word for a variety of publications, including The Book Collector, Manuscripts, Amphora, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And tonight, he will be talking about some of the things emerging collectors should think about as they build their collections. Spencer asked collectors with decades of experience one question. With 2020 hindsight, what do you wish you had done or known to do when you started collecting? Tonight, Spencer will share the responses from these individuals and attempt to bring key points into focus for us. If you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Spencer W. Stuart, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Spencer, it's all yours.
Kevin, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining me this evening and sharing this time together and having some of these conversations. You know, as Kevin mentioned, this was something that came to me as I was putting together the 2021 review of various clients that I work with. It was a question that, you know, I've been dealing with emerging collectors and people who are building their collections, people that are thinking about the future of their collections, and I thought, what are some of the things that are, you know, on their minds in terms of when they're building them and where they're at. And so, you know, as I mentioned in the announcement, and Kevin reiterated, you know, I sent this question out. What do you wish you had done or known to do when you started collecting? And you know, as you can imagine, I received quite a few responses coming back, and it was mostly from it was a couple different collectors, about 7 collectors that had a list of different things that they'd made mention to. And some I noticed were related. Other ones were unique to that particular person. And it really sort of characterized an interesting dynamic that I'm seeing in the development of collections now, especially between emerging collectors who are making use of the technologies of the day to make their informed decisions of how to build their collections and maybe are forming unique pathways, and people who have built collections through a continuum, through a change in the way collecting has been carried out, from working through catalogs and bibliographies on into some of the opportunities that are presented in the online sphere. And so, you know, in order to make sense of these, I laid them out, and in thinking about them, I thought about them as in some ways, you know, situations that had passed, things that were now, you know, the collecting had gone underway, and in some ways this could not be returned to, things that could very much be changed or considered in one's collecting in the moment and could be started really at any point while you're still in the act of collecting. And then in other cases, things that had not yet even occurred to the person that was, you know, wishing that they'd known something or wished they'd approached their collecting in a very particular way. And so tonight, what I'll do is I'm just going to go through the various responses. In some cases, these are a synthesis of a couple of people's responses. In other cases, these are unique responses that are connected to a particular collection. So I'll be jumping through a couple of case studies this evening that work to kind of flesh out some of these comments. And in that case, they connect to that specific collector that made that comment, or you know, there's a comment made, a wish that was not fulfilled in the way one collected that I see made manifest in another collection that I'm working with at the time. So, you know, we'll kind of go through it. I think it's important in this talk to think about your own collecting practice or that of people that you know around you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards as well, in terms of people's experience of collecting and some of the things that they wish they knew or that they're carrying out in their act of collecting now. So, you know, 2 to start off with, and these aren't really ones that are case studies, but they're more kind of approaches to the practice of collecting. The first one here being that, you know, why do they say I have time, and what does that mean? Now, the they in this case, you know, I probed further with this question, with this statement. In this case, it was seasoned collectors talking to this collector when they were setting out. And And so I asked, what did you think they meant when they said that you had time? And this collector said that it was to do with making mistakes in the building of their collection, that that they learned from what they acquired that might not have been along the lines of what they wanted to explore, um, and that they kind of didn't really have an objective at the beginning of their collection. It would take time to get to that sense. And in that way, this is something where this thought of a large collection, it doesn't necessarily mean, that a large collection doesn't necessarily mean it's a quality collection. And this idea that one has time to make the mistakes, I think it's something that's often thought of um, in relation to not having much information in building one's collection. Um, and so, trying to understand that time, it's this idea of when you're building out your collection, what do you do with the time that you have to make the collection? Do you acquire material? Do you do research to make selective decisions? This is something to kind of reckon with when you're building out your collection, and when you start to get into that situation, which comes into the second comment of that I had identified when I got serious as a collector. And this changes for a variety of different people in terms of the definitions of their collecting. This is something that often happens, that you felt when you hit your stride as a collector. In this case, the person who made this comment, I asked, when did you feel that you were serious about your collecting? And it was when the items started to, unpack kind of a series of lines of thought about a particular theme. And I think this very much connects into the case example that I'm using for this next comment, this next wish that was connected with a collector I spoke with, which was that I had understood my relationship to the topic that I collect. So this is a collection that particularly concerns itself with childhood education and the different processes by which, within mostly the lens of Western culture, children's education was approached. So, as you can see, it comes from a chronological perspective. It also comes from different materials, different theories of how information are conveyed. So you see Orbis Pictus, one of the earliest kind of illustration books connected with children's education. Some of Rakes's articles are also or rather articles within journals are in this collection, and very, very much connected with the Sunday school movement in the 1780s. On into some of these discussions, as you can see, with Froebel gifts, some of the physical objects, and as well the Montessori collection. Now, this is a collection where, this discussion of wishing to understand the relationship to the topic. The collector in this case is also is an educator for children, and works particularly with people with learning disabilities, and looks towards the different ways those treatments have been written about and approached by educators, in the present time. And so in some ways, this collection can still change into that discussion, and is one that actually connects with her research library and some of the materials that are connected there, and really helped in her own approaches to the topic and how it's changing over time as well. And so in this sense, it's one that is in the moment. It's very much something that can kind of that can be made aware of. It can connect with the collecting as it began. In some senses, there's not really any kind of mistakes in the approach here. It started as a kind of very general, and now it's honing in to very much the connections that she has as a practitioner of childhood education. And so this is one that this comment was made at a time where the collection is now starting to go into this discussion of her own activities and involvement in these topics, and how this idea of a collector being someone who is an antiquarian collector, in a sense, someone who is engaging with a preconceived past, or are they someone who's connected with, is bearing witness to something that's taking place? And in that case, is dealing with objects that are not really yet defined through bibliographies and through previously established collecting practices. And very much it's a before and after for this collector. They've started with a pretty well established approach and some quite well known materials, and now going into a more regional approach of how within North American culture, the approach of dyslexia and other learning disabilities have changed and morphed through the 20th century. Now, moving forward, another response that I got, these two responses very much connected, and ones that in a variety of different ways were brought up by the respondees. Now, this idea that I'd gone to school on my collecting interest, uh, collecting it concerns itself with one's passionate interest in a topic, which means that one is already, they're already consuming large amounts of information pertaining to a topic on a daily basis. This is in some sense kind of a byproduct of developing the collection. Um, and but in some cases, consumption of that information and the absorption of it are sort of two different things. And I think it is important. And in these cases, these are collectors that are really starting actively they're kind of in the middle portion of building their collections. They're still very much acquiring material. But in the case of the two that have made this statement, they are now engaging with what I would think is kind of the collecting community. So that's through, trade and auction catalogs, bibliographies, and exhibits. Getting a library card and spending some time in the university stacks and seeing how the various topics that are connected, how they interrelate. And I think expanding into this discussion of when you're building a collection, looking into what is academia saying towards the topic that you are interested in collecting. How are the materials being interpreted and contextualized by academics? Which departments are making use of this material? And what are some of the meanings and conclusions that are being drawn from the materials? And to keep records of this, keep kind of a journal, or working records as to how these interpretations are changing, in relation to your own collecting. Some interesting overlaps can start to come into fruition. And then the other one here, this kind of part and parcel with this idea of going to school on one's collection, of thinking about it as a research assignment as well as a collection, is to have led collecting with research and make that kind of an informed decision for when you're acquiring materials. In the case of one of the collectors here, they often talk about that if they've perused a catalog and they come across something that hadn't occurred to them but is connected to their collecting topic, it's sort of a fork in the road that they need to be cautious about. That either it's an item that's not entirely relevant to their collecting focus, and in that case, they should sort of step back on it, or this collector also says that this shows a limit to the knowledge that they have about the collecting focus that they're interested in. And so in that case, oftentimes steps back, has a look at what are the chances of this material reappearing, and kind of and get a sense of what is the context for those items within the collection, and how are they relevant to some of the topics that they're trying to address in the collecting that they do. Very much approaching this idea that building a collection through research is similar to using a blueprint in order to build a house. Now, moving on into another example here, this is connected with, and this was a comment that was coming up on a number of different respondees, and I'll use an example of a collection that I think is really sort of pursuing some of these conversations, but this collection wasn't connected to the collector that made these comments. So what was I guided by the exceptional or the exemplary? And I'll use the case of a collection that I'm working with that has to do with gift bindings. So gift bindings are of a very particular period of time. The bibliographies There are a couple of them, but foremost among them here, as you can see, is the Victorian Publishers Book Bindings, and as well a Ball from 1985. These are very much the kind of reference points for some of the designs of gift bindings, as you see through Humphreys as well as Owens from that period of time. And this is where you have this question of, okay, so in looking at these bibliographies, this bibliography can be a list that I use as the reference point to fulfill the objective of the collection that I'm trying to make. And gift bindings, in terms of their general history and their understanding of it, it's paper mache in most part, and very much tries to emulate Gothic bindings from a different period, to resemble wood. And very often they have quite ornate ornamentation on them, as you can see. But one of the issues is that they perish quite quickly. It's very difficult to find extremely fine copies. And so this, you're kind of at a fork in the road. If you look at the slide and think to the left, you're dealing with the established bibliography in these two bibliographies in the center screen. And then you have the question of, do you want simply all the examples of gift bindings within the bibliography? And then within that, do you want the finest copy, or do you just want examples of it? In that case, not many, the condition doesn't particularly matter. Now, fine copies of these is very difficult to track down because of just over time, the way that those copies perish. But the ability to, purchase ones that are in some cases detached quality is not terribly difficult. Now, there's another route here. Something that you start to find when you start to search around for gift bindings is there are many instances of paper mache bindings contemporaneous to Humphreys and some of the book gift bindings that are connected to these established bibliographies. However, they're not registered. And they very much, they're often used by publishers to recirculate text blocks that we're not selling. And so you find some interesting examples. And we've also found some real aberrant versions as well, in the search for various pieces. So this goes into an idea of these are both, we could go into an exceptional category here. We could start to sort of look into gift bindings that are kind of beyond the realm. In that case, this idea of condition starts to change. If we're just sort of looking towards different instances of ones that are not yet recorded, this really changes the situation. And it changes the risk factors too. For instance, you see this piece in the Milan piece from the 1850s. There's only sort of two appearances that we've seen of this one. It came through auction, and now it's offered in through dealer catalogs. And it's this question of, is it worth purchasing to put into the collection? Where are the references to other ones? It's really one of these things that once you start looking for them, it becomes another question, a whole nother line. And so you're away from the bibliography, and you're now on an unpressed track, thinking about this context of gift bindings, how gift bindings were used in the time to really connect with a new social group that were connecting with reading and the book as object. Now, moving on to another example here, this was a comment, and these also connect to this idea of, to understand the precedent for my collecting practice. So who are the players that are connected with your collecting, your interests? Is this something that is completely an area that's not been dealt with before? Or is it something that is established? Is it in institutions? Is it a way of collecting that is well known by private collectors? Is it something that dictates the way dealers stock their inventories? Auction houses put together shows, you name it. Is it something that's pre-established? And then within that, starting to understand that precedent, this collector also talks about, understanding the layers within the various sources. So where this collector was thinking about the idea of where do I exist within this established network that collects. And in particular, this collection involves itself with scientific debuts, where this was only a couple years ago, this collector really wanted to sort of engage with this topic and started to realize that there was really an established realm. And in that sense, very much limited the possibilities of where items would occur and what would be the prices for those items, which connects to what are the investments that I'm putting into the collection I'm trying to build. Certainly something that's not a deterrent if someone really wants to pursue that, but to understand how they're connected to it, what are the likelihoods of those collections, how much of this material is already in institutions, private collections, these sorts of things. It starts to allow you to situate yourself in the project of building your collection. And this is one where, a lot of this material, I think it'll be interesting to see if it starts to come onto the market in the near future. I think it's in, there are a lot of this materials in institutions, is in established institutions through the connections with the history of science. And there's a huge amount of overlap with this topic. It connects with not only physics, but, in this case, I'm using lots of physics examples, but this collection's also connected with, Edward Jenner and vaccines, these early publications, biology, chemistry, these sorts of things. It has lots of overlap in its generality, which has it engaged with some very pre-established, sections. Now, this is one that is really fascinating to see going on, and in particular with this collection, this is a collector that is focused particularly on the history of computer technologies, AI, things of this nature. So Lovelace, Turing, as well as Bernays and others. And the comment that was made was that I had not ignored pop culture references. So moving back really quickly to this discussion of going to school on one's collection and the type of information you consume, the type of research that you enact in order to inform your collecting. This was a case where, a couple of years back, as you can see, I'm sure many of you on this call have seen this video or seen this film, The Imitation Game, which is connected with Alan Turing's life and the Enigma machine. This came out in 2014. The article Computing Machinery and Intelligence, written by Turing, was one that was absolutely on the list of must-haves for this collector in building their collection. And was only recently acquired by the collector, who's been sort of working on this collection for many years now, slowly but surely. But in looking at the price differences that happened in terms of the availability of this material, that was certainly on his radar when he was building his collection. But after the interest that came out, certainly from this film, but also some of the just expansion outwards afterwards of collectors for Turing related materials, be it notebooks, be it the Enigma machines themselves. There was very much overlap that was going on. And at the time I was involved with auction houses, and you could sort of see this real interest, which started to spill over and overlap with people's other collections. In this case, this was someone that was looking particularly at the history of computers and AI, and this is spilling over the influence where a collector who's interested in purchasing, say, a wartime notebook is also starting to gather up, journal articles and things of that nature, which are, not as significant within the large, well, certainly significant for their collection, but in terms of monetary investment, it's not a massive change. It's considered much less than, say, the notebook or the Enigma machine. So this is an idea where you can start to see like how it changes the pricing of material. And this can work both ways. If you're someone who's collecting, say, for instance, chess material, after the Queen's Gambit, there was a huge interest in the building of collections around chess. And I had some clients that were working building collections relating around the history of chess, where they were able to offer materials up, and there was huge amounts of interest in it, and it allowed them to sort of clear up space in their collection, raise some funds to, focus on other things that they were trying to collect at the time. Another one is, you see this in sci-fi as well, Dune being the most recent example, where there's really some enthusiasm. And if you're trying to, this is a collection management consideration as well. If you're trying to build your collections, to keep an eye on the announcements for upcoming films, things of this nature, and seeing how those impact. Certainly, in some cases, they can. So that's one that is always quite interesting to see, how does that track, how does that change, and how would that impact your collection development moving forward. Now, this is another sort of double example, and it's one that connects with a lot of people that responded to the question that I posed. This idea of sharing their collections with others, wishing that they could relate their enthusiasm and interest to their collecting. I think that was one that was a pretty common theme. But this comment here, which I think is connected too, is that I stayed curious. This collection started out as a gift, which was to this collector a fairly significant run of the Library of America, which went into an interest in first editions, and particularly the dust jackets, the design, the kind of real enthusiasm of this type of collecting, which is well established. You see it in catalogs, and is not entirely difficult to build a collection if you have the means to do so, and certainly has a kind of focus to it with the various points and various details along the way. But this collection, went into an interesting kind of move where this collector started to sell those materials and started to focus on the reception of these books, which at the end of the day, it was the authors that this collector was really interested in, was the graphic design and reception of these books in other contexts outside of the North American context. And so this resulted in the building of a collection of a variety of different covers of well-known, books from the Western canon of literature. So you start to see, in this case, it was an example from 2019 of Grapes of Wrath, published in China. You have 1955, Old Man and the Sea, published in Russia. In Iran, 1955, Lolita. On the Road in Croatia, 1971. This is just a few of the various versions. And around the same time, this enthusiasm, which it opened up into different channels. It was no longer looking just at catalogs or through through auction results or possibilities in that milieu. It was now into kind of eBay and things of that nature, starting to be able to spend money on items that were quite a few, and it became an idea that it wasn't just a single item that signified, but it was in relation to the other ones. Laying these out on a table is really quite an exciting process. And so what happened from there was, these were conversations that started to come up with educators that this collector knew. They're a graphic designer. They started to bring classes over to have a look at these different books, and now we're in discussion about placing this collection as an example within a graphic design collection moving forward. So, this is a case where you're moving from, trying to think about this approach of your collection as something of a kind of that has a social potential, that it's something that's not so much related to just yourself and the building of your collection, but something that could be a catalyst for other people to relate to it and build some ideas and really use it as an engine moving forward in their own inspirations and their own conceptions of something, say, as the book as object, and how is content distilled through the graphic design of a book cover. Now, the final example here, the sort of 12th thing that came up, um, in some ways goes counter to the one that I started with, this idea that, that you have time, and that in this sense, being aware of what time means when one is collecting. Uh, to be able to spend the time to go to school on the topic that you're interested in, and really use it as a kind of a research project to inform the act of collecting and building that collection. This was a collector that is, this idea that I budgeted for expression. Uh, I probed a little further as to this idea, because we've been working particularly on the expressive part now, but what I didn't realize until we had a conversation was that it was actually a detour. Looking at the collection, this collection concerned itself mostly with musical notation through mostly the Western tradition, from 1500 onward. And so we're dealing with some of the, as you can see here, Beethoven publications, shape notes that you see in the Sacred Harp, and other things of that nature, all varieties of different notation techniques. But what started to happen is that this collector started to, purchased a concert bill at an antique sale. It was an estate sale that got into the idea of, there's the notation of the music, and then there are the individuals that perform this music, and particularly the kind of transformations that have taken place, from arguably Liszt's onward, of the cult of personality that's connected to the people that read and perform music. And so, this collection is now going into concert performances, appearances when possible, and some of the composers that are really that have really changed things into the 20th and 21st century. Glenn Gould, being of course one that was more of an interpreter, but there are discussions about the way in which he played a lot of the musicians that he was interested in interpreting. John Cage, of course, for many reasons, the silent piece and what the implications of that were for composition moving forward, and the idea of music. Um, Going on into Philip Glass's collaborations with Robert Wilson, and so forth, the compositional approaches of Philip Glass's music. Max Richter, who has done some interesting work in terms of the experience of new classical, as it's referred to, through his projects such as Sleep, where audiences are invited to stay through the whole night and listen to and sleep through compositions that he's made, as well as his reinterpretations of the Four Seasons by Vivaldi. So this becomes something where now the collection has a bit of grain to it. Before it was connected very much to the different techniques of communicating notation, and then moving into the graphic design elements, the where people are playing, how they're presenting themselves. These sorts of things start to come into play as classical music makes its way in to the 20th century and is engaging with forms of other technologies to broadcast, the movement of classical music as it goes into the future. And so, this is one in which it really is this thought of, sometimes there's these items that don't quite fit in your collection, but might open up into perspectives and ideas that have you going in a path that may not be previously established by collecting practice before you, but certainly connects to your personal story and your engagement with these objects into the future. And so it kind of adds, as I said, this kind of grain to it, this texture, which makes it so unique. So I would say, finishing off here, and now I would love to open up the conversation, but is to be brave when one is working through their collections and thinking about pre-established techniques and approaches, and moving into the unbeaten path, these sorts of things. So with that, I'll open it back to Kevin, and thank everyone again for their attention. And as I said, I really look forward to the conversation, and any kind of lessons that collectors have learned, or questions that people have starting out with building their collections.
Great. So I'm back, and I'm glad you put up that the contact and information slide. I was going to ask if you had one of those. We definitely are sending that out in the email we send to everybody who came and everybody who didn't make it this evening. So in case they wanted to reach out to you, but I wanted to first say thank you for sharing these key points, these ideas from some of these collectors. I think even seasoned collectors or experienced collectors or mid-career collectors can kind of benefit from some of these recommendations or these concepts or things that they wish they knew, maybe they struggled with. I know that I probably could talk to you about this kind of stuff all day. You know that I'm just like fascinated with the mind of a collector. Like, why do they collect? Why do they collect what they collect? How do they go about doing it? And again, I could ask a ton of questions, but I'm going to ask the participants who are here to use the chat and the Q&A if you have some questions or some comments or some thoughts that you want to share with Spencer. Like, put them up there now, because we'll pull some of those questions out of there. I want to start with saying that I think that I have a question. Which one? I have so many of them. So do you want people first to contact you with how, what their answer to your big question is? Would that be okay if people reached out to you and emailed you and said, hey,
Yeah,
here's what I thought I wish I knew when I started? I think that might be helpful to inform, more research on this. I have, I think, a hard time with understanding, or I struggle with collecting with your mind. A lot of these collectors are super thoughtful and strategic, and I think some of that came over time as they better understood their topic or realized where they could access materials to build their collection. But I think I struggle with, in terms of my collecting, I think I'm more emotional about my collecting. I see something that is kind of in the big umbrella of what I collect and I'm interested in, and I acquire it. Do you have, what do you think about that in general? Do you have clients or any of your 12 that you talk to kind of mention that in terms of how they started out? Were they more emotional, or were they always thoughtful and strategic? And like, I collect this, even though, as you mentioned, like, some wish they had gone to school, right, and learned more about their topic, or they had done other things.
Yeah. Is your the collecting that, without, if you don't want to go into details, but is it collected with like a visual component to it? Is it like sort of a visual art, or is it text based, or?
Yeah, it's more artistic. I collect graphic novels and comic art and original, comic art. But I have always, in one of your commenters said that they wish I had paid more attention to pop culture references to it. Now, part of what I'm collecting is really pop culture, but there are other aspects of pop culture that are not directly what I collect.
I'm thinking of like, there's the scenarios where collectors that I've spoken to, they have a situation where they're visiting a bookstore and they see an item that they know of. And there's that, like, across the room, see the thing,
right?
Emotion flood, then you're hit with it, right? And then there are situations where, say, it's someone who is trying to piece together a visual history through photographs of a particular region, and they see photos and and those are connected to, say, the landscape of the place that they're collecting around. And that's a feeling of like, I don't really know what this is. I know it's connected to that geography that I'm interested in collecting. I must have this thing.
Right. Okay.
It relates, And so I think the emotional part is there. And then, I think if you're, it's that sliding, it's that spectrum of people that are working through, say, a bibliographic informed collection, one where there's some pre-established lists, and then there's maybe a bit more expansive openness to the definition of the collection that they're trying to look at. So say like pulp designs from, from such and such a date to another date, and seeing something that you're not sure who the artist is or the context around it, but it to be connected to that. And then, there's enthusiasm in that recognition. There is an element of recognition, and there's certainly an excitement that's connected there as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of those moments for a serious collector is when it's tethered to like a body of knowledge they're building, or a record they're trying to form through the collection that they're building. It's another example that reflects the interest that they have in something.
Yeah.
But it certainly feels, after you see that item and recognize it, there is that brief moment where you're just taken aback by that item, right?
So we're going to get back to, you made a comment about bibliography. So I have another question about that in terms of kind of understanding the precedent for someone's collecting practice. So we'll get back to that in a second. But Robert had a question, which I should have asked first, or should have brought this up first, which is, what is actually a collection advisor? Like, what do you do, and why would somebody want or need to have one? And maybe start a little bit just talking about what you do and how you work with clients.
Right. So I work on a variety of, at different stages of private collectors' collections. So if they're emerging collectors, if there's someone that's working on trying to set out building their collection, working with them on what are some of the resources that are available to them, what are some of the places in which they can source material, how can they think about it in terms of what are the possibilities for the appearance of those materials into the future, these sorts of things, kind of analytics to understand the dynamic of the marketplace in all of its different facets. That can move into also mid-career collectors, people who are trying to locate materials connected to their particular focus that's already established, or if they're interested in repositioning, these sorts of things, helping them on those processes of deaccessioning materials or acquiring new materials. And then with mature collectors, thinking about legacy, thinking about advising them on placement of collections into institutions or through estates, through onto their family, these sorts of things, thinking about what's the future of their collection. I don't hold any inventory or anything. I work on behalf of the collector, and it works in a sort of subscription basis. So we would engage in kind of a year of the project. With the kind of collection consults, it's a bi-weekly review, and then quarterly reviews through Zoom or in person, talking about their collecting objectives and where they're moving on to the future.
Got it. So one of the things that one of your collectors says was they wish they understood the precedent for their collecting practice.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's something that you would help somebody with, maybe help them understand their collecting practice. But and how do you do that? Where do you go? Who do you talk to find out what the precedent is for someone's collection focus?
So, depending on what the topic is, there can be a bibliography that's been formed on the various titles that are related to that particular theme or that particular writer. There can be a marquee collection that's within an institution that was a gift from, in some cases, a prominent collector that really focused on that topic. And that becomes really the kind of reference point or the standard by which one would collect on that topic. One would apprehend that topic through different titles. And that very often, that kind of practice of these bibliographies of private collections and also institutional collections continue to this day to be a reference point for people in the trade building inventories for items that they want to acquire to offer to collectors. So it becomes kind of a reference point. You see it in, when you're looking at a dealer's collector or an auction collection, a reference to a name, such as, I was showing you earlier, Ball 1985. You can say Ball and then the page number and that reference, or the item number, usually the item number, and that kind of references back to the lineage, or in that case, what I talk about is the precedent of of the topic that you're interested in collecting. And so in that sense, it's something that's recognized. It's something that is already circulated through institutions. So in thinking about where are they in terms of holdings, like if you want to go see these items to maybe get a sense of what they are before acquiring them, but also it informs, the purchasing of those items. It's something where the value can be somewhat acknowledged and is known to other collectors. So in the case of the example I use of scientific debuts, in almost every case, when titles appear that fit the purview of that collector, there are several other collectors that are interested in acquiring that material, and they're marquee items within that collector's collection too. So it might be a collector that's interested in chemistry, right? And so there becomes this overlap in which, in an auction setting, it may result in some aggressive bidding. And then in a catalog setting, it may result in the item being sold before one is able to get in touch with the dealer. So just that understanding of, if you want to start a collection, sometimes it can be discouraging to go, yeah, I want to start this collection. And you start to see listings and you start to ask and stuff is already going. You just to understand, okay, what is the demand? What is the awareness of these items in the market? Because sometimes if you're not aware of those dynamics, it can feel overwhelming to people trying to build collections, and it can be a deterrent, impacting people pursuing it further.
Arthur has a great question, and it's always a fun one. We'll get to that in a minute. It's about some of the biggest mistakes you've seen collectors make in their process. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of the points that you shared. The whole question about being guided by the exceptional versus the exemplary is so interesting. And I liked the gift, the publisher's findings, as the example for that. What are you seeing? Do people do one or the other? Are you seeing a overwhelming number of people focus on the exceptional? Because again, back to my personal collecting practice, I would love to have only the exceptional stuff, but I'm getting what I can get, right? Because I want that item. I'm not a completist necessarily, but if I want something, I'm not going to continue to wait to the most perfect item in the world. I'm going to try to get it, as an example of that work. So what do you see out there in terms of that happening?
It does depend. I think I find a lot of people who are working on trying to understand the series of an appearance of an item. So are purchasing the first, second, third edition of a text. Often cases, those collectors are in some ways academically connected, either in the past or in present, to the thing that they're collecting. And so in a sense, there's this, to someone stepping back who's not fully aware of that collecting focus, those things may appear to be more or less the same. But in fact, variations, changes open up to the idea of the formation of a text or a print as being a social event that's connected to a number of different actors involved in that process. And in that sense, the object becomes, certainly it's the manifestation of that moment. It is the thing. It's a Goya print or a Rembrandt print or whatever it might be. But it steps back and speaks to a network of actors that are at that time that will that item to be made. So I think that it's sort of a networked way of thinking. I'm noticing it a lot in collectors that are, as I said, academics who are sort of studying the more the history approach to it, and are also are maybe thinking more about communications, theories of communication in a different way. Now, at the same time, there are collectors they work with that are interested in the finest condition of a book, and I think in a way that's also interesting. It's almost like a sense of trying to return to the object in its appearance at the time in which it was came into the world, in a sense, you know, trying to see it at that time. They're kind of different approaches. And I think certainly there are different investments too, monetary investments, time investments in terms of the availability. You know, if you want a fine quality, you know, the first edition of something or the first appearance of a rare text, it's something where it may cost quite a bit, and it might be something that's quite rare in terms of its appearance at auction or through dealers. So you have to wait, you know, and so that becomes a whole another mentality. It takes discipline as well in a different way. So it really does depend on what those items are. And you know, in the case of the first editions that I was showing you, that went on into just the appearance of that text within different cultures, you know, that was kind of a move out of not only the price of the items getting a kind of bit too rich for him, he was also just sort of not interested in getting the finest non-price clipped dust jacket copy of a first edition. Was starting to get really, you know, it was just thrilling to get these little paperbacks of something, you know, and you know, like in you know, for instance, the Lolita copy, which is really a strange cover because it's sort of a Xerox, almost like a photograph of the still of the Kubrick film, which is then screen printed onto the cover. So you know, that speaks to the object and the history, you know, the industry around making books in a particular time. So I'm seeing both in a lot of ways, and I'm seeing that the fine versions, the primary versions, there's more information about how rare those items are when they appear to make that decision. But I'm also seeing at the same time collectors who are starting to look at you know, the more the duplicates, the iterations of something over time. They're able to make those collections much easier than I think previously known because of you know, because of online searches and their connections to dealers, auction houses, these sorts of things. As there's just more items circulating in the market, it allows for that kind of thinking to happen. I think it's some ways a byproduct of the digital world in a way.
Someone sent me this question about the the, the sharing of they wish they had showed or shared their collection more.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned a little bit about, you know, they thought of that. If they had done that, they would have been more of a catalyst, right? Or an engine for thought in other collectors or something on that topic, or an inspiration. Is that really all that's there? Or is there more maybe behind that about sharing, exhibiting, right?
Yeah.
Your collection to,
Yeah. Well, it's in some ways it's always a portrait in a way of the person that's making that collection, right? And so it is something, it's intimate. It's like time taken to understand those topics, the time taken to source them, build those relationships in order to find that material. And yeah, so you know, you're proud of it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being proud of it. You know, I think it, you know, it could be in some contexts like seen as a superiority thing, but I mean it more in the sense of um, as there's a transference that happens when you're with objects. You know, there's that tangible connection with the objects that when you can set it up in a way that's kind of on the table for people to have a look at it, and if they have questions, that can be a moment where you start to look at it differently too. You know, and I think that what happens when you share your collection is that, you know, if you're going towards the research in a very serious way and you're starting to feel like you're quite knowledgeable about it, you start to feel that that's the one way to go about it. And in some cases that can start to slow down the endeavor of building the collection because you feel like you know everything about it. And you know, I know cases where collectors share their collection with someone, you know, a family member who doesn't really know much about the thing, and it brings to mind something that they're interested in. And then here we go, right? That starts to become something that connects those people and connects them to that collection. They return to using that collection as almost a catalyst for other conversations. I think that's pretty powerful, you know, and that's something that starts to get the collector stepping back for a second and thinking about that relationship, so it doesn't stay so insular. I think that that's something that was an idea about collecting, and certainly happened because there were less channels through which people could share their collections. And absolutely, there's a history of collections being connected with prestige and power and these sorts of things. There's a strong history of that. But I think that there's also there's a tradition within collecting, and certainly now, back to this discussion of people's relationship to their collections, um, of a more activist, bear witness to the changes that are happening around you, and how you relate to them. This idea of like the collector that's looking into different forms of education. It's she's tracking not only the history of sort of dyslexia and how it's been treated over time, but also homeschooling, unschooling, all these different alternative forms of education. And it's turning out to be really fascinating material. And it's something that you don't see reflected everywhere, but it's a I wonder if thing, and it came from her having conversations with colleagues about her collection and showing it to them as well. So
I think there's just so much more opportunity now, like over the last 2 years, with virtual events for people to share their collections in small groups. It's not the only way to share a collection isn't a big exhibition at the Book Club of California. It is, you can, be sharing it in a community meeting or with your book collectors club, in person or virtually. So I think there is the joy and the pride of sharing their collection more now, so more than ever. So I think
when you stay insular with your collection, there is always that feeling of like, what am I doing? What's going on here? This is something I think about a lot, and I think it's valuable stuff to think about. And it's also stuff that I think really connects with people. It's something that gets them thinking as well. It's kind of beyond the collector that's putting it together in a way.
Yeah.
Put that stuff out there and people start to look at it.
There's a level of personal inspiration and review when you talk about your collection and share with other people. Like you just said, you're like, why am I doing this? Like,
I find it really difficult sometimes to think about collecting in general. It's something that I find, like when I'm talking to collectors now, because of the techniques and because of the availability of different technologies and access to information, there's as many collectors collecting forms as there are collectors. And sometimes collectors will employ different practices, different ways of collecting for the different collections that they have, right? So it's this way of being, it's this way of thinking about being with objects in a way.
So there's Alice has a great question in here. She says, for the beginning collector, what are your tips for documenting collections? And what details should be in your bibliography? And I love this last part. What details do people regret not writing down? What do they wish they had written down when documenting their collection?
Yeah. Something I'm finding just de facto is taking, like by default, it's a lot of emerging collectors. I'm thinking like late 20s, 30s, which is that cohort of emerging collectors. I should say that, there are collectors I've worked with who are starting out and building their collections, and it's later on in their lives as well. So, but I'm finding that people are just right off the bat using Excel. I think Excel is nice and solid. It relates to different computer programs and computer operating systems into the future. So you never have this issue of stability. So I'm just further moving towards that. I've talked about softwares in the past, and certainly there are some, but I think Excel works really, really well, is very versatile. Yeah, details that they wish that they included. I think just staying consistent with naming, particularly of authors. Are you doing it all caps, last name, comma, lowercase for the first name, this sort of thing? Just keeping that kind of uniformity is useful just for moving forward. And then just the source by which you acquired the material. Was it through trips? Was it something that you were acquiring online? And then for the most part, I find a lot of the clients I work with, they do document the price at which they got the material for, and that's always interesting. just to sort of track it, especially if you're working on something that is popular culture, such as the touring material. You know, if you're looking at comparables, which is something I work with clients on, and thinking about that, how to analyze that material, that information, that's something that really helps you to understand, you know, what are the changes, fluctuations in the market, what might be some of the reasons for that, depending on the, you know, condition and the description of the item that has been offered in the past, these sorts of things. So that helps to sort of think about the particular object you're interested in collecting, but that there are multiples of that object in many cases. And they're all in different conditions, right? So there's a couple of different layers there that if you don't have the information about your item in terms of its condition and the price you got it at, and then maybe some other items that have been offered in the recent past around the time you acquired it, and some material that's been offered since, you know, it's kind of useful to get a sampling.
Yeah.
To understand that.
Great. So we're going to go to Arthur's great question. It's a great way to kind of close out. From your experience, what are the biggest mistakes you have seen by collectors in building their collections? Just a couple. You don't have to go into all the big mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, there's one collection I think in particular that it's a good story. I mean, at the ultimately the way the collection has gone is really fascinating. But it started out as Hollywood memorabilia signed posters, connected. You know, these were acquired during trips to, you know, Las Vegas, LA, places like that. Certificates of authenticity, these sorts of things connected to Hollywood movies that this person, you know, liked because they were connected to the DVD collection that they had. And I was contacted by this collector because they were thinking about, you know, the collector's from India originally, and was aware of a history of cinema in India, but was wondering about, you know, playbills, posters, these sorts of things in that context. And so we started to really engage with that material and you know, antiquarian material, that type, you know, connecting ephemera in many cases. And it moved away from the way in which he'd been engaging with the collection, the technique by which he had been collecting to begin with was he happened to be on the main strip and would just purchase these items because he was sort of drawn to them in these memorabilia contexts. And so there wasn't much discussion or thought about the provenance, where materials could be sourced, you know, where this material might have come from, and that process of, you know, the signature became kind of a draw for that material. So it was surfing. It was not the deep dive approach, which he was capable of. I mean, he was sort of very aware of the history of cinema, and in North American context, wanted to beef up on the idea of the history in India, which is so interesting because it's concurrent with a lot of the developments and interests in the building of an industry as that of North America. So you know, you're seeing sound film contemporaneously. You're seeing color film, these sorts of things all happening, and there are these big moments. These were watershed moments, and so that collection went into also then starting thinking about the reference collection of the theory behind Indian cinema and its different approaches, which also developed in a really interesting way. And this has moved into the possibility of it being used as a reference collection for studies in the Lower Mainland, where I'm based. So we're going from like Sunset Strip to to a collection that is not as flashy, but it's like it's just, you know, it's really rich in terms of its in terms of what these objects signify. There's kind of modesty in the objects of being just like posters, playbills, these sorts of things, but then they connect to the books, which are not always easy to source locally, certainly, and are, you know, film history books in many ways. They're academic books, but speaks to, you know, it's an accumulation of really interesting ideas and topics about something that's connected to also his, you know, his personal history, where he's from, and his interest in cinema and his family's interest in cinema. You know, connects him back to his grandfather that was interested in the history of film as well. So, you know, it's just a so that was kind of a mistake in the sense that at the beginning, I mean, I think a lot of the the certificates of authenticity, the signatures, they were questionable. There was not lots of reference, and they didn't really elicit anything. You know, they connected to the DVDs, and I don't know if that would have, that collection would have continued. I think he was sort of tired of it, and was feeling really, you know, kind of embarrassed about it. Well, they weren't being hung up or anything. But this new stuff is engaging with people. It's becoming a real reference point. So I think that's a turn.
Yeah.
There's probably a couple other mistakes I'm thinking about, but that one's one that really comes to mind.
So what's the next big question that you're going to ask your clients, right? You had this one. What did you wish you knew or would have known? What's the next big question to ask them?
That's a good question. I think I'm, you know, I'm seeing collectors at present that are, there's so much, you know, I did a talk about auctions a little while ago for the club, and I've written some articles on the various activities that are happening, the way that auctions are changing, you know, online platforms and brick and mortar auction platforms. There's lots of material that's going through there, and there's lots of kind of once in a lifetime opportunities that I'm seeing for collectors that are acquiring material that they'd always been looking for, didn't know when the opportunity was going to present itself, and they're presenting themselves because of demographic shifts that are taking place, but also just like opportunities for collectors to offer this material in whole new different forums online. And so, you know, maybe it's a question about what's next now that you've acquired a keystone part of your collection. You know, in some cases, this is stuff that people are building up towards, and then they get it, and it's like, whoa, okay,
yeah,
that's next level. So, I mean, just immediately off the top of my head, that's something that I think would be a question I'd ask collectors.
You could always go with your biggest regret. That's you know, everybody wants to know that answer if they'll tell you what their biggest regret is.
Yeah. I think, you know, that would be that. Yeah, I think that's probably a good one as well. I like to say positive about the act of collecting.
I know.
I think there is this certain amount of unknown that people engage with, which in some cases can be dispelled by research and awareness. So, you know, I think the regrets can be mitigated, hopefully.
Well, you have what's the best thing you did, right? In building your collection, what was the best move you've made or something like that?
I'm gonna ask
tons of questions for you.
You got 3 questions. I'm gonna ask those questions. 3 questions. Those are the questions I'll ask. Yeah.
So we're at 6:15. We're just gonna wrap up now, and I will say that I'll say a big thank you, Spencer. It's always great to have you back and talk to you about all these things. These things I need to remind myself to ask myself and in building my collection. So thank you so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for attending this Book Club of California program tonight. Our next online presentation will be Monday, May 16th, a week from tonight at 5 p.m. It's titled Sharing Our Desert's LGBTQ+ History, How It All Began. And it's going to be a presentation by David Gray, who is the co-founder and the co-chair of the LGBTQ+ History and Archives of the Desert in Palm Springs. This is a program that's being presented in association with Rare Books LA Palm Springs, which is a big book fair that opens later that week on May 21st and 20th and 21st in Palm Springs. David's going to share a brief overview of how and why the archives began, what their current collection houses, their exhibitions, and their future plans. So it should be super interesting, and I hope you can join us. You can register for that program online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you are probably receiving from the Book Club of California. We'll also be sending out email information about Rare Books LA Palm Springs if you're interested in maybe attending. So thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Spencer. Everyone be well and take care of yourself. Good night.